Have you ever wondered why a God celebrated for his love would command the destruction of an entire people? In the ancient pages of the Bible, God's decree against the Canaanites, a mighty nation dwelling in the Promised Land, rings out like a thunderclap, leaving even the most devout pausing in reflection. What was so horrific that it drove God to issue such a severe judgment? And more importantly, what does this reveal about your own journey through life's greatest challenges? The story of the Canaanites is not just a dusty chapter of history. It's a spiritual mystery, a puzzle of justice, faith, and God's plan for humanity. In this video, we'll peel back the layers of secrets behind God's command, uncovering the untold truth about why the Promised Land became a battleground of light and darkness. You'll discover that this story isn't just about an ancient people. It speaks to the heart of the battles you face today, battles that demand courage, obedience, and unshakable faith. If you're ready to dive into the truth behind one of the Bible's most controversial chapters, leave a comment with the number 888. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe with notifications to join us in exploring more inspiring Bible stories. Now, let's step into the Promised Land and the realm of spiritual conflict to uncover why God truly commanded the destruction of the Canaanites. Canaan, described in the Bible as a land flowing with milk and honey, Exodus 3:17, was not merely a fertile region but a marvel of the ancient world. Positioned at the crossroads of great civilizations, Canaan served as a bridge between the mighty Egypt to the south, the prosperous Mesopotamia to the northeast, and the seafaring peoples of the Mediterranean. Stretching from the cedar-covered mountains of Lebanon in the north, through the lush valleys of Galilee and the Sharon Plain to the harsh Negev desert in the south, it bordered the sparkling Mediterranean coast and the verdant Jordan Valley. Golden wheat fields gleamed under the sun, vineyards bore heavy clusters of sweet grapes, and cool streams nourished the land, painting a vibrant picture of nature's splendor that made Canaan the envy of every nation in its time. Canaan's strategic location didn't just offer natural beauty. It transformed the region into a bustling hub of trade and culture. Ancient trade routes like the Via Maris, Way of the Sea, and the King's Highway crisscrossed Canaan, carrying gold, frankincense, and luxurious purple fabrics from Phoenicia. Port cities like Sidon and Tyre thrived as vibrant centers where ships from Crete, Greece, and Cyprus docked, laden with exquisite pottery and exotic goods. Archaeological discoveries, such as those at Tyre, reveal bustling markets and storehouses filled with jars of olive oil and wine, testifying to the land's wealth. Yet Canaan was more than a material treasure. It was the land God chose to fulfill his promise to Abraham, Genesis 12:7, where his descendants would become a great nation, bringing light to the world. But this promised land was not an empty canvas. It was occupied by powerful nations, their city-states fortified with massive stone walls rising dozens of feet high, and armies trained to repel any invader. Strongholds like Jericho, with double walls reinforced by stone and clay, stood as symbols of impregnable strength. So why did a land so breathtakingly beautiful, seemingly perfect in every way, become the focal point of God's severe command? The answer lies in its inhabitants. The Canaanites, a people not only mighty in warfare but steeped in the darkness of idolatry, turning the Promised Land into a battleground of divine justice. The Canaanites were not a unified nation under a single king, but a loose confederation of independent city-states, each wielding its own power and identity. Jericho, with its towering stone walls, described in Joshua 6:1-5, was a fortress designed to withstand any assault. Hazor, a northern powerhouse, was one of the largest cities in the region, with an estimated population of up to 40,000 at its peak. Sidon and Tyre, thriving port cities, were not only trade hubs, but also centers of production for purple dye, a luxury reserved for ancient nobility. These cities were ruled by powerful kings, protected by walls several meters thick, reinforced with advanced construction techniques and guarded by watchtowers and heavily fortified gates. The Canaanites' military might struck fear into neighboring nations. Their armies were equipped with bronze and iron weapons, and their warriors were trained for brutal combat. Most daunting were the descendants of Anak, giant-like warriors mentioned in Numbers 13:28-33, who instilled terror with their imposing stature and strength. Israel's spies, returning from Canaan, trembled as they described themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. Archaeological findings in Hebron and Lachish, believed to be strongholds of the Anakim, reveal massive structures with stones weighing tons, suggesting a people of extraordinary physical prowess and engineering skill. Beyond their military strength, the Canaanites boasted a vibrant culture. Clay tablets from Ugarit, a city closely tied to Canaan, reveal an early alphabetic script, intricate poetry, and mythological tales about gods like Baal and El. They were skilled artisans, crafting finely decorated pottery, gold jewelry, and artworks traded across the Mediterranean. Yet this brilliance masked a chilling reality. Their culture, though materially advanced, was dominated by a religious system that led them down a path of irredeemable corruption. The Canaanites' military and cultural achievements, impressive as they were, served as a veneer for a heart that had forsaken holiness, setting them on a collision course with God's purpose. The Canaanite religion was the core of their downfall, with gods like El, Asher, or Astarte, and Baal shaping every facet of their society. Texts unearthed in Ugarit in the 20th century portray El as a supreme but cruel deity, often depicted as drunken and lustful in mythic tales. Asher, the goddess of fertility, was revered as a symbol of motherhood and nature, but also linked to sensuality and sexual rituals. Baal, the god of storms and rain, was central to Canaan's agricultural life, where rainfall determined crop survival. Yet worshipping Baal went far beyond seeking blessings. It involved practices the Bible deems detestable. Deuteronomy 18:9-12. In Canaanite temples, such as those uncovered at Megiddo and Giza, rituals transcended ordinary worship. Ritual prostitution was integral, with holy servants, both men and women, engaging in sexual acts to appease the gods, believing this would ensure fertile lands. Ancient texts reveal these practices extended to incest and ceremonies reenacting violent myths, like Baal's battle with the sea god Yam. Most horrifying, confirmed by both the Bible and archaeology, was child sacrifice. Stone altars at Giza, Carthage, and other sites bear traces of infant bones burned as offerings to Molech, the god of fire and destruction. These children, often firstborns, were placed on blazing altars in the belief that such sacrifices would secure rain, bountiful harvests, or divine protection. These acts were not the work of isolated extremists, but institutionalized in Canaanite religion. Sacrificial rituals were performed publicly, celebrated as acts of devotion, and documented as part of their cultural life. At Carthage, a Phoenician colony linked to Canaan, thousands of clay urns containing infant remains were found, inscribed with dedications to please the gods. In God's eyes, these practices were not mere sins, but a direct affront to His holiness. A society willing to sacrifice its most innocent lives for empty promises from false gods had forsaken all traces of humanity, calling forth an inevitable divine judgment. According to the Bible, the Canaanites were descendants of Ham, Noah's son, through Canaan's lineage, Genesis 9:20-27. An incident where Ham disrespected his father led to Noah's curse on Canaan and his descendants. Though not the direct cause, this curse foreshadowed the path the Canaanites would choose. Over centuries, they built a culture rooted in worshipping false gods, rejecting the one true creator for idols of stone, wood, and gold. Ugarit texts describe complex myths like Baal's battles with rival gods, reenacted through public rituals filled with lust and violence, reinforcing a value system that glorified debauchery and cruelty. The Canaanites' corruption was not an overnight descent. It was the result of centuries of wrong choices, gradually severing their connection to truth and plunging them into the darkness of idolatry. Deuteronomy 12:31 warns Israel that the Canaanites did every detestable thing the Lord hates, especially child sacrifice. Archaeological evidence shows that Canaanite altars were not just ritual sites, but symbols of a society that had wholly turned from basic moral values. Their corruption reached what the Bible calls the fullness of their sin, Genesis 15:16, meaning they had crossed a point of no return, rejecting all chances for repentance or reform. The Canaanite story is not merely about an ancient people, it's a timeless warning. When a society embraces cruelty and worships false gods, it sets itself on a path to destruction. God's command to Israel, though severe, was not an impulsive act, but the culmination of a long process, where His justice had to be enacted to safeguard His redemptive plan for all humanity. Why would a God described in the Bible as full of compassion and mercy, Exodus 34:6, command the complete destruction of an entire people? This question perplexes many, making God's decree against the Canaanites one of the most controversial topics in Scripture. But to understand it, we must look beyond the surface and recognize that this command was not an impulsive or cruel act. It was the culmination of divine justice. In Genesis 15:16, God told Abraham that his descendants would possess the land of Canaan only in the 4th generation, because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. This phrase reveals a profound truth. God does not rush to judgment. He patiently waited centuries, giving the Canaanites every opportunity to change their path. God's justice is not like human justice. It is not driven by emotion or vengeance, but by His absolute holiness. When a people sink so deeply into practices that defy the Creator's intent, reaching a point where repentance is no longer possible, justice must be enacted. The command to destroy the Canaanites, recorded in Deuteronomy 7:1-2, was not merely about seizing land. It was about eradicating a system that threatened God's greater plan. If the Canaanites' practices were allowed to persist, they would act like a toxic storm, sweeping away the moral and spiritual values God sought to establish through Israel. Consider this: when a dangerous disease spreads through a community, sometimes the source of infection must be removed to protect the lives of many. Similarly, God's command was a spiritual surgery designed to shield Israel from the spread of corruption. What's striking is that God did not act without warning. For centuries have He sent signs and opportunities through prophets or natural events to call the Canaanites back to truth. Yet they refused, choosing a path that led to their destruction. Thus, God's command was an act of justice, executed with the precision of a judge who knows every detail of the offense. This leads us to a deeper question. What else was God protecting in Israel beyond the land itself? God's command to destroy the Canaanites was not just about eliminating a physical threat. It was a safeguard against a far greater danger: spiritual corruption. The Israelites, newly freed from slavery in Egypt, were a young nation, vulnerable to the influences around them. The Bible records God's repeated warnings about the risk of imitating other nations. Deuteronomy 12:29-31. If the Canaanites were allowed to remain with their alluring rituals and captivating belief systems, Israel risked being drawn into idolatry, abandoning their covenant with God and the purpose for which they were chosen. This danger was not theoretical. Israel's later history shows what happened when they failed to obey God's command. In Judges 2:11-14, the Bible describes how the Israelites began worshiping Canaanite gods like Baal and Esher, leading to moral decay and divine punishment. The Canaanite rituals, blending sensuality, power, and promises of fertility, held a powerful allure for a people fresh from the deprivation of the desert. A dazzling temple with mesmerizing ceremonies was far more tempting than the strict teachings of holiness from God. This threat went beyond worshipping stone or wooden idols. It involved a worldview entirely opposed to God's intent. While the God of Israel demanded righteousness, love, and obedience, the Canaanite gods promoted debauchery, violence, and the sacrifice of the most sacred values. If Israel succumbed to this influence, they would lose not only the promised land, but also their role as a light to the nations. Isaiah 42:6. Thus, God's command was not merely about destroying a people. It was about protecting a chosen nation meant to carry his redemptive plan to the world. But how could a physical war carry such profound spiritual significance? The conquest of Canaan was not just a series of military campaigns. It was a spiritual confrontation of timeless significance. In God's eyes, this was not a war between two peoples, but a clash between the light of holiness and the darkness of depravity. The Canaanites, with their belief system, represented a distorted worldview where moral values were inverted, and human life was devalued. In contrast, the God of Israel stood for righteousness, truth, and love, values he intended Israel to bring to the world. The metaphor of light and darkness is more than poetic language. In Psalm 27 verse 1, God is described as my light and my salvation, while the Canaanite practices are called the darkness of the nations in Scripture. Isaiah 8 verse 19 to 20. The conquest of Canaan was thus a spiritual battlefield where God used Israel to establish his presence in a land defiled by idolatry. Every altar torn down, every idol shattered, declared that there is only one true God, and he does not tolerate what harms his children. Notably, this war was not just about seizing land. It carried a greater purpose: to establish a holy nation, set apart to be a kingdom of priests. Exodus 19:6. Israel was called not only to dwell in the promised land, but to become a beacon illuminating the surrounding nations, pointing them to God. If they failed to eliminate the Canaanite influence, that beacon would be extinguished, and God's redemptive plan would be at risk. This war, therefore, was not merely about swords and shields. It was about safeguarding a sacred promise that would transform human history. God's command to destroy the Canaanites was not merely about justice or protecting Israel. It was a critical part of a grander plan: God's redemption of all humanity. When God promised Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation, Genesis 12, 2-3, he was not speaking only of land or material prosperity. He spoke of a nation that would bring blessing to all the families of the earth. Through Israel, God would establish a covenant, deliver his law, and ultimately send the Messiah, Jesus, to redeem the world from sin. The Canaanites, with their beliefs and practices, posed a direct threat to this plan. If Israel were drawn into idolatry, the covenant with Abraham would collapse, and the path to redemption would be obstructed. God's command was thus a strategic step in his divine plan. It was not about annihilating a people, but about ensuring that Israel could fulfill its mission: to be a holy nation, living in obedience and reflecting God's glory. In Isaiah 49:6, God declares that Israel would be a light to the nations. And this mission began in Canaan. Every step of the conquest, from destroying altars to establishing the covenant, was part of a larger plan to bring salvation to the world. God's command, though severe, was an act of love, not only for Israel, but for all humanity. It reminds us that sometimes, to preserve what is best, God must remove what is harmful. In this story, we see a timeless truth. God's justice and mercy work hand in hand, guiding us toward a higher purpose. How could a people freshly liberated from slavery in Egypt, wandering for decades in the desert, possibly confront the impregnable fortresses and giant warriors of Canaan? This question sets the stage for the story of conquering the Promised Land, a journey that demanded not just physical strength, but above all, unwavering faith and absolute obedience. The Israelites, freed through the miraculous parting of the Red Sea, Exodus 14:21-22, endured 40 years in the wilderness, sustained by manna from heaven, Exodus 16:4, and guided by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, Exodus 13:21. Yet the desert was more than a physical trial. It was a spiritual crucible, where God forged a people accustomed to slavery into a free nation, loyal to Him. Standing at the threshold of Canaan, Israel faced a challenge greater than their desert years, conquering a land teeming with formidable enemies. God commanded Moses to send 12 spies to scout Canaan, Numbers 13:1-2. This mission was not just to gather intelligence about the land, cities, and armies, but to test their faith. When the spies returned, they brought enormous clusters of grapes, proof of the land's fertility, Numbers 13:23. Yet their report split into two camps. 10 spies were overwhelmed by the towering city walls and massive warriors, declaring, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." Numbers 13:33. Only Joshua and Caleb, trusting in God's promise, insisted that with God on their side, nothing was impossible. The faith of Joshua and Caleb was not mere optimism. It was rooted in their experiences of God's power, from the parting of the Red Sea to water flowing from a rock, Exodus 17:6. But the fear of the 10 spies spread like a plague, plunging the people into panic, complaints, and even a desire to return to Egypt, Numbers 14:1-4. This reveals that Israel's true challenge was not external enemies, but internal fear and lack of faith. Their story poses a timeless challenge. When faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles, will you trust in God's promises or let fear take control? Israel's lack of faith was not just a moment of weakness, it was a rebellion against God, leading to severe consequences. By refusing to enter Canaan out of fear, the people doubted not only their own strength, but the power of the one who delivered them from Pharaoh. In Numbers 14:11, God asked Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, despite all the signs I've performed among them?" The consequence of their disobedience was a harsh decree. The entire generation, except Joshua and Caleb, was condemned to wander the desert for 40 years. 1 year for each day the spies scouted Canaan, Numbers 14:34. This period of wandering was not merely punishment, but a refining process. In the desert, Israel learned to depend entirely on God, from manna falling each morning to water springing from rock. Yet, these lessons were hard-won. The people repeatedly grumbled, rebelled, and even turned to idolatry, as when they crafted the golden calf. Exodus 32:1-4. Each stumble was an opportunity for God to teach them about loyalty and holiness. Over 40 years, the older generation faded away, and a new one arose, a generation untainted by Egypt's slavery, prepared to enter the Promised Land with renewed faith. The cost of unbelief was not just delay. It was a stark reminder that faith and obedience are the foundation of a relationship with God. In Psalm 95:10-11, God declared that the faithless generation would not enter His rest. But the story doesn't end in the desert. Joshua and Caleb, steadfast in their faith, became beacons guiding the new generation. Their resilience shows that even in the darkest moments, faith can pave the way to victory. This leads us to a question. If unbelief leads to failure, what happens when Israel finally chooses obedience? When Moses died, Joshua was chosen as the new leader, receiving a powerful promise from God. Be strong and courageous, for you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors. Joshua 1:6. With this declaration, the conquest of Canaan began, a journey rooted not in military might, but in absolute obedience to God's will. The first challenge was crossing the Jordan River, swollen with floodwaters, seemingly impassable. Joshua 3:15. Yet the God who parted the Red Sea performed another miracle. As the priests stepped into the water, the river stopped flowing, forming an invisible wall of water, and Israel crossed on dry ground. Joshua 3:16-17. This miracle was not just a physical triumph, but a declaration that God was leading the way. The Battle of Jericho was the pinnacle of obedience. Jericho, with its double walls, meters thick, stood as a symbol of Canaan's strength. By military standards, besieging such a fortress required catapults, ladders, and months of preparation. But God commanded Israel to do the unthinkable: march silently around the city for 6 days, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and on the seventh-day day, shout after 7 circuits. Joshua 6:2-5. Israel obeyed, despite the plan's apparent absurdity. When their shout rang out, Jericho's walls collapsed, not by human strength but by God's power. Joshua 6:20. This victory not only opened the way for the conquest, but also served as a reminder that obedience to God is mightier than any fortress. The conquest didn't end at Jericho. Joshua led Israel to victories at Ai, Gibeon, and other city-states. Joshua 10:1-14. A remarkable moment came when God made the sun stand still to ensure Israel's triumph. Joshua 10:12-13, proving he not only guided but fought for his people. Yet the path wasn't always smooth. Achan's disobedience, keeping spoils from Jericho, led to a temporary defeat at Ai. Joshua 7:1-5. Once the sin was addressed, victory was restored. These battles show that Israel's strength lay not in swords or shields, but in faithfulness to God's covenant. The conquest of Canaan is more than an ancient history page. It's a spiritual portrait with lessons that resonate in modern life. Canaan, with its fortresses and mighty foes, symbolizes the challenges we face today: temptations, fears, or pressures from a world that pulls us away from truth. In Hebrews 4:1-2, the author reminds us that the promised land is not just a physical place, but a spiritual rest, a fulfilling life in communion with God, overcoming trials through faith. Joshua's call to be strong and courageous, Joshua 1:9, is not just for Israel, but for us. Each of us has our own Canaan, giants of doubt, walls of fear, or temptations that shake our faith. These might be societal pressures, harmful habits, or past wounds. Yet Israel's story shows that victory doesn't depend on our strength but on obedience and trust in God. When Israel marched around Jericho, they relied not on weapons but on the power of the one leading them. Likewise, we are called to face challenges by trusting God, even when the path ahead seems unclear. The conquest also reminds us to tear down the idols in our lives. These idols aren't necessarily stone statues, but can be habits, thoughts, or ambitions that distance us from God's purpose. In 1 John 5:21, we are warned, "Dear children, keep yourselves from idols." Just as Israel was commanded to destroy Canaan's altars, we are called to remove what hinders our relationship with God. This story isn't just about a nation's triumph, but about the victory each person can experience through obedience. What is your promised land, and how will you choose to enter it, with fear or with steadfast faith? The story of the Canaanites and the conquest of the promised land is a journey far beyond ancient history. It testifies to God's power, leading His people through impossible challenges and paving a path for humanity's redemption. From the fallen walls of Jericho to the fulfilled promises of Abraham's covenant, we see a God who is both just and merciful, fighting for His people and guiding them to a higher purpose. Now, it's your turn to reflect. How has this story changed the way you view life's challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments. Just a brief sentence about what you've learned or felt from this journey. If this video has given you a fresh perspective on the Bible, hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe with notifications so you don't miss our next story. We're exploring the mysteries of the Bible together, and this journey is far from over. Join us as we uncover more stories of faith, courage, and God's power. See you in the next video, where we'll continue unveiling the sacred pages of history, bringing you closer to timeless truth.